and grind.
Woke up soon this morning.
What are you
When
doing?
the clock was striking 4.
What happened?
Ought to get my baby crying, Daddy, please don't go.
Show me the train you call a cannonball. That's the train, don't stop here at all.
My mama told me when I was quite a child.
What'd she tell you, boy?
Have a good time now, but trouble after a while.
If you ride the seaboard, I ride the LNN. Mama, that's the train that sure carry in the wind.
My mama told me when I was 4 years old.
What'd she tell you?
You gonna be around the horn, God bless your soul.
Low down, mean old fireman, a cruel old Indian, yeah. Took my good girl and left me standing here.
I'm gonna buy me a mansion.
What you gonna
I'm
do?
gonna carry it to the sky so I can see my baby when she comes passing by.
Well, I took this brown-skinned woman from my best friend, and that rascal got looking, stole her back again. I woke up this morning with the rising sun. Said go away day and let tomorrow come.
Well, good afternoon. It is good to see everybody. We are going to broadcast this on Facebook Live as well. So if you have friends that would like to watch some of this later, so no, you could not have stayed home. That does not count. And so it's so good to see you. Thank you for coming out on a beautiful afternoon. Just a couple of quick notes, and then we're going to jump into this. And today is going to be fun. We're just going to have a good time. You know me, that's what we do. The music you were listening to is from Pink Anderson and Blind Simi Dooley. I know all of you have their albums. Pink Anderson was from South Carolina. Blind Simi Dooley was from Hartwell. And both of them were, Simi Dooley taught Pink Anderson how to play the guitar. And they both were singers in 20s and 30s. And were phenomenal and were hits in Europe more than they were in the United States. And the band, you know, there's a British band called Pink Floyd. Remember them? Oh, yeah. Well, they thought that Pink Anderson, when they were putting the band together, that Pink Anderson was such an incredible guitar player that's why they're named Pink Floyd. Because of Pink Anderson, who was born in South Carolina, who learned to play the guitar from Blind Simi Dooley, who was a blind Hartwellian, who grew up here in Hartwell in Hart County. Now, we're going to dim the lights in just a second. I want to remind you of a couple of things. In the back, we have cookies you must eat. You must eat. You must eat at least 10 cookies apiece. There's also some tea and water. There are some books. There are History of Hart County books that we have for sale if you would like one of those. Again, those are excellent. I forgot what year those came out. Do you remember? I don't remember. They were, I think, in the 90s, I think maybe, up until that time. I can't, Peggy's looking. 2003, was it really? Okay, so 03, the Baker book was the old one, and then these were the new ones, that's right. Okay, 2000. Then we also have History of the Churches of Hart County, of the surrounding area. We have those books available. We also have applications. We hope that you'll consider joining and being a member of the museum group. The museum is, you look at First Baptist, and it's just the house just to the left of First Baptist. The way you get there is you got to go around the block and turn into First Baptist and then go in there. It's open on Fridays right now. The more members we have, the more opportunities we'll have to be open. There's lots of displays, and we're in continuing process of trying to make our museum more available and a better representation of Hartwell and Hart County. We're trying so hard to make it good for this community. I know that Hydra is coming later on. They're bringing all of their kids to see it. And so I hope that you'll take sometime over the next weeks and go to the museum. There's several things in there. There also, if you go, we will give you something. We have 4 sewing machines that came out of the sewing plant downtown, and 2 of those we would gladly give you. And so if you take it while you're at the museum, you don't even have to tell us, do they? And there's some beautiful things that came from Hartwell. There's the first electric radio that was in Hartwell. There's also a telephone booth in there. There's an old pew from First Methodist and a couple of things. So let me tell you about some things that are here in this church too. We have in our cabinet through those 2 doors, and we're not going to do anything about this church today, but there's a historical room in there, and there are 2 pieces of tools that belonged to John R. Kay, who was the builder of the first house in Hartwell. And he was a businessman, and his family's still in this church. And the front window in the sanctuary is dedicated to his memory, because he died in 1896 when they were building the sanctuary here. And there are 2 tools that he used and that were used in the construction of this sanctuary over here. And they probably were used in the construction of the earlier sanctuary building, which was the first sanctuary building here in Hartwell, built in 1856. and it stood exactly where this building stands, and there's a handsaw that was his that's been restored by the family and donated to the church, and there's a little thing written about it, and there's also a lathe, is that what it's called, or what's that called? It's a piece of wood, used to scrape wood. Anyway, it's a plane. He actually signed it, and so it has his name on it. So there are two very neat things in there that we have of his, and he was a remarkable man. And we'll do some more things on him later on, but not today. Today we're going to talk about murder, mystery, and mayhem. Now, I don't know if any of you are on Facebook. Everything on it is true. And there's a great page that's called Tidbits of History, and that is put on Facebook by Aubrey Sims. And if you are on Facebook, like his page, because he has the neatest stuff, and some of this came from him. And so a lot of nothing is mine. I got it from somewhere else. Somebody asked me today at church, how long have you put into preparing for today? Now, you will think maybe 25 minutes. I bet you I've put 30 to 40 hours into this just for today, because I've been combing Hartwell Sons and Athens papers and everything, trying to find a different view. And I'm going to read some weird things to you. They wrote things differently in the 1880s, and they described things that happened very differently than they do today. In our society, we've cleaned things up a whole lot, and I'm going to read some of those articles to you today. So are you ready to go back in time just a little bit and maybe learn something new? Are we ready to do that? And so, all right, Jim, if you'll hit the lights, and let's see, and like I said, Jonathan's got us on Facebook Live. And so we're going to look at a couple of things we've looked at before, and it's hard for you to see, but there's a map in that circle. These things will come out later as we talk. The map, of course, is Hartwell and Hart County in 1779, and in 1779 there was no Hartwell in Hart County, of course. Now, circled is a little place that is called Fort Charlotte. Fort Charlotte. And that is a very interesting place because it becomes a town later on, which is now under Lake Thurman. Or in Georgia, we call it Clarks Hill Lake. All right? And so then you can see 1796. Now it's called Petersburg. And the only reason I'm telling you that is we're going to talk about Petersburg for just a few minutes towards the end of our program. I know it's not under Lake Hartwell, but it's under Clarks Hill Lake. And in 2008, when the lake was so low, parts of Petersburg became visible again. And the park in Elberton, in Elbert County, there were fences and there were roads and streets and other pieces of the buildings, because Petersburg was the second largest city in Georgia at one time. There were banks, and there were blacksmiths, there were all kind of business in Petersburg. They also had brothels, and so that was a very popular thing. And then there were three cities right there: Vienna, Lenzburg, and then Petersburg were all on each side of the Broad River, the Savannah River. Then as we move to 1830, we still don't have a Hartwell or a Hart County, but you can see Franklin and also Elbert County. And in 1830, those two counties existed. And also you see a little bit forming. You've got Petersburg down there in the bottom. And then you've also got a city up in the top area, which is called what? What's under our lake? What town? Andersonville. Andersonville. Andersonville had a mill, and it had several businesses, and was a fairly good-sized town. Started in the early 1800s, but then came to its demise. Then as we move a little bit later, you can see, and you see Andersonville at the top, and you see Petersburg towards the bottom, and then we've still got the counties as they're formed. 1856, then we finally get Hart County. Yay, Hart County. Because Hart County wasn't formed until 1854. In 1856, that's when Hartwell If you look closely at this map, it's hard for you to see, but Hartwell is not on there because Hartwell was not a city until 1856. So when they did this map, Hartwell was not a city. Now, no, maps don't excite you, but I just thought this was so interesting, and so I thought I'd bore you for just a few minutes, okay? And so then, of course, the town selected for the spot selected for the town was a prominent and popular place for hunting, and it was a crossroads for the Cherokee, and it was right there beside City Hall. And right there around where City Hall is, where Benson Street comes into that area, there was a huge granite rock that was in the shape of a large chair. Did you know that? And it's where hunters would sit and shoot deer as they came along the path. And eventually, they used dynamite and blew out the rock and built the city of Hartwell all in the surrounding areas. So that was a hunting spot for Cherokee and also a traveling spot. So all of that. Now, again, this is the first baby that was born in Hartwell. His name is, where is he? Oh, yeah. William, guess what his middle name is? Hartwell. William H. Cole, Hartwell Cole. If you notice, it's hard to see on the gravestone, but he was born November 14th, 1854. He was the first baby born in Hartwell. Hartwell is not even a city. It was a county, but it wasn't a city. But the city was started in 1856. And he died in 1931. He was 76 years old. And this is in Pelzer, South Carolina, is where he is buried today. He was the first baby born in Hartwell. Now, we've had a couple of problems with several things. We've lost some jails. I'm going to show you a couple of things, and I got some good stories on that. And then also, we've had trouble with courthouses here. Have you noticed? The first courthouse was a log cabin, okay? Billy Kidd was in it. He helped build it. This is the second courthouse. Billy is in this picture. It was a two-story structure. It was somewhat elaborate. It was pretty. It's hard to tell in black and white photos, of course. We don't know for sure. There's no definite definition. They think this may have been a jury. They don't know for sure. But this is probably the front porch of that wooden courthouse. Guess what happened to that courthouse? Burned. Yeah, it burned. Okay. Then this courthouse was built in 1856. This courthouse was beautiful, had a beautiful columns and everything else, built in 1856, lasted during the war between the states. Guess what happened in 1900? Burned. Yeah. But it was also, that's the first grand jury of 1888? Yeah. And look, that's outside that courthouse. That's on the side of that courthouse. And that is a brand new picture in the Georgia archives. I just found that, combing through those articles and all those newspapers. There's also a picture of that courthouse, and a tornado hit in 1893, and it tore the roof off, part of the roof. And you can see the damage of the front. You see the front portico. You see that's that 1856 courthouse that burned in 1900. Oh, look what was built in 1902. And the more I look at this courthouse, it was just absolutely beautiful. It was beautiful. It was very ornate. This is the picture. There's a fountain right here in the front, and this is the very same picture as this picture. Right there. The very same picture when it burned. Who remembers the date it burned? Okay. Walter Gordon was around the square and saw some of the early flame marks. There's also a question in town whether y'all said it, but I don't think y'all did. But it was such a tragedy for us. The state of Georgia's had a very difficult history with courthouses. The courthouse burned in Warren County. Theirs was built in 1904. All these counties lost courthouses, and when they had them burned, you know what happened? All their records were lost. And so there are many, many thousands of records that were lost in counties in Georgia. And so then, of course, we have the courthouse we have today. We also had some jail problems. The first jail was a log cabin. Then we had another jail that was made of wood before this one. And I want to read you a little article. Oh, this is great. Let's see. At 10:30 o'clock Monday night, the people of Hartwell were startled by the ringing of the church bells, which would have meant this church bell. Fire. Responding promptly, it was discovered that the jail was on fire. When the crowd gathered, the whole roof was in blaze, and the first thought it was to rescue Jim Cornog and Barry Bradley, who were inmates. They were confined in a cell upstairs. Jailer Scott lives a half mile from the jail. Somebody jumped on a horse to gallop, but it was apparent that quick work had to be done with the prisoners. And what had happened is the prisoners had set the fire. And there's a whole story. I've got a whole 4 pages. It was indeed a close call, and they almost were burned to death. It says in the article they were almost cremated. That is the actual words. In fact, the article. Okay, this is the this is the title of the article. Prisoners narrowly escape cremation. You wouldn't see that today. And it talks about how they were arrested and they were in the smoldering debris. And that jail was built in 1878. And then they came along and built this beautiful jail over there and right after that. And this is a jail we had until we have the current new jail, which is just a beautiful, beautiful jail. And everything is very functional. That's the one that was built over there. And I hope one day we can find some way to use this structure, because that's a gorgeous building, and it's historical in its nature. And so we need this building restored somehow, some way. All right, so then let's move on. We talked about that. Now, we cannot talk about odd history if we don't, schools. Oh, yeah, we had some problems with schools. Look, 1907. Here's the Hartwell School, the public school building in Hartwell. And then they built that, which they did pretty good. And then guess what? That burned. All right. So then we can't do anything unless we talk a little bit about Nancy Morgan Hart. She was a character. And I've talked a little bit about her over the years in history, but every girl should know Nancy Morgan Hart because she was an incredible woman in her own right. She's believed to have been born in the Yadkin River Valley in North Carolina in 1735. She married Benjamin Hart, moved with her husband to northern Georgia, and they had a family. They had 6 sons and 2 daughters. The approximate site of her frontier cabin is along River Road in current Elbert County, and there's a constructed replica of her house over there at not Hart State Park, but the Nancy Hart site in Elbert County, and they actually built the chimney of the cabin with stones that came out of Nancy Hart's cabin. And so all that is built in Elberton, and we need to take a field trip over there one day and bless it with Hartwellian time. Now, of course, that's the replica. She grew up, she was very tall. She was a muscular woman. This is a description of her from around 1917. So she was very tall, muscular, with red hair. She had blue eyes, and she had smallpox scars all over her face. How delightful. She was feisty. She had a quick temper. Local Cherokees referred to her as, do you remember? War woman. That's what you want the Native Americans to call you, okay? She was illiterate, but ran her household well and was knowledgeable about frontier survival. She was skilled as an herbalist and an excellent shot. We know that for sure. During most of the war years, she was alone on the frontier because her husband was serving as a lieutenant in the Georgia militia. And so she had to run the household with all those kids, all the sons and daughters, and she had to run all of that. And y'all, she would sneak away periodically, and she was a spy for the Patriots. She would dress as a man and go into the Tory camps and get valuable information and pass it on to Elijah Clark's men and other patriots. Amazing woman. And she would pretend to be feeble-minded in order to gain information, which she subsequently passed on. Nancy's daughter noticed a Tory spying on the family through a hole in the wall. Nancy just happened to be making lye soap at the time, and threw a ladle full of boiling soap through the crack, scalding the man. She then hogtied him and turned him over to the patriots. So this is an incredible woman, but this is her most famous story. And most of you know this, but I thought we just needed to talk about it a little bit. Tories were ravaging the whole countryside. Remember that during the American Revolution, this was more of a civil war than it was a war for independence in this area, because Georgia was the newest colony, and a lot of the people in Georgia did not necessarily want to separate from England because they were new, and it was a new colony, also in the backwoods of South Carolina. There were roving bands of Tories, and they came to Nancy's cabin and they shot one of her turkeys. And then they said, "Cook this and feed us." And she said, "Okay." She pretended to go along. She sent her daughter out under the guise of getting some water, but she secretly instructed her to notify the neighbors, her and her husband, and to get help. The Tories made themselves comfortable, and then guess what Nancy did? She said, "Hey, look what I've got in the cupboard. A brand new bottle of corn liquor." And so they drank the corn liquor, they got comfortable, they propped their muskets up, and the whole time this was going on, she was passing their guns through a hole in her cabin to her daughter so that they would be totally without any guns. Well, right before she got to the last one of them noticed what she was doing. She picked up the gun, she pointed it at him, and guess what she did? Boom! Killed him on the spot. Nancy then held the rest of the men at gunpoint until her husband and her neighbors arrived. Now, this has always been folklore. We didn't know for sure if this was true. One of the men said that all the Tories should all be shot, but Nancy declared that they should be hanged because they shouldn't waste the bullets on them. All right. Now, so it's a good story, and it's folklore, we think, and it's very interesting. Well, here's another story. And I wanted to read a little bit from the paper. This is from an article from the Savannah Republican, 1824, around when this was written. The old-fashioned matron of Amazonian strength and habits occupied such a conspicuous stern during the times that men's souls and women's too, that they were expedient to take a passing notice of some of her because she was so prominent. Okay? And then this whole article talks about Nancy and that it says in the article that she was the ugliest woman you've ever seen. Isn't that horrible that it says that? Okay. So then, 1912. A lot of you already know this, but 1912, while they were doing some work grading on a railroad, the Elberton and the Toccoa Line, the Eastern and the Elberton Railroad, 6 skeletons were unearthed by a squad of those digging and making the rails. They were buried about 3 feet under the ground in what is known as Herd Field, near the mouth of the Wauhatchie Creek, which is right near where, guess whose cabin was near there? Some half a mile from where it empties into the Broad River. This is the way the article described it. The bones are all there in a splendid state of preservation, but have become disjointed. It gets better. Remember, this is from 1912. The skulls. In fact, all the bones of the heads and underjaws are especially well preserved, and the teeth are perfect. The place where the skeletons were unearthed, together with the fact that they are so close together near the surface, with no sign or trace of anything like a coffin anywhere around makes the evidence convincing that these are the bones of the Tories captured by the revolutionary heroine who lives in the history as the cross-eyed and ugliest woman of the period. She was also said to be cross-eyed. I forgot to tell you that. Now, and my question is, how can you be cross-eyed in a good shot? Which way? The house that Nancy Hart lived in was located on Wauhatchie Creek near a spring some half to three-fourths of a mile from where the skeletons were found. And so now we know for sure this was a true story. That's a picture of the cabin, the Nancy Hart cabin. And what's funny to me is look at these pictures. The cabin looks very spacious and large. And when you look up Nancy Hart, it'll have these pictures crossed out, and it says these pictures may contain something that is not liked by everybody. What? A woman holding a gun. That's exactly what it is, which is ridiculous to me. So then we have, and look at all those two. Those are pretty Nancy Hartians, and so I don't know. But that's her cabin, and then this is her gravesite, because later, in later years, she became a devoted Methodist. I don't know why I felt like I needed to tell you that. They built a Methodist church. They moved to Brunswick. And then she moved to a couple of other places, and they eventually moved to Kentucky. She became a Methodist. In fact, she became a shouting Methodist because she was on fire for the gospel. According to the writings of George Rockingham Gilmer, Hart's Methodism was adopted around the time that she was living in Edgefield. Gilmer was a former governor of Georgia who claimed to have known Hart personally before she died. According to Gilmer, Hart heard how the wicked might work out their salvation and became a shouting Christian and fought the devil as fought the devil as manfully as she fought the Tories. How nice. Around 1803, John Hart moved his mother and family to Henderson, Kentucky to live near relatives, and her gravesite is from 1830, and that is in a place, and one night we will gather here in this room, and then we will take our bus and shovels and bring Nancy Hart home to Hart County. Okay. And so one night we're going to do it. There's a couple of things else I got us to do, all right? Now, somebody, Lou Ann Burgess said, are you going to talk about the murder of so-and-so? No, because those people are still living. I ain't going to talk about nothing that when nobody's still living, because that brings up hard feelings and that could hurt somebody. So I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to bring up some murders that happen around here that none of y'all would know about. Well, maybe a few of you, but not everybody. The first one is a very important character to Hart County in the surrounding area. His name is Job Bowers. Have you ever heard of him? Job Bowers. He is the father of William Bowers, and William Bowers is the one that founded what town that we know? Bowersville. That's exactly right. And see, Job Bowers was a neat character. There was a roving band of Tories. Okay, in 1779. Roving band of Tories that showed up at Nancy's house that day might have been the same group that was killed, who also killed Job Bowers. Job was born in Virginia in 1755 in Welsh ancestry, and he later moved to Wilkes County, Georgia, which is now, we call it Hart County. Remember, they took parts of Wilkes and Franklin and Elbert to make Hart. Now, when the Revolutionary War broke out, he joined a local militia. Now, October of 1779, while serving in the war, he was given a furlough to return home to check on his wife, Charity, who was due to give birth. And when he got home, he found a baby boy by the name of what? William Bowers, who was only a few days old. While he was home, this roving band of Tories drug him from his house, put him outside of his house, shot and killed him on the spot. Now, historians believe that that's those 6 people that did that to Job Bowers may be the same group that Nancy dispatched later on or before. We don't know for sure how all that happened, but it is very likely that they are the same ones, all right? So Job Bowers was killed. He was only 24 years old when he was murdered. And remember that he was the father of William Bowers. Now remember William Bowers, we're going to talk about him a little bit later. Now there's another murder that happened in 1865 that is kind of a classic situation where there's two sides to the story, and I'm going to only tell you one because it just sounds better, okay? His name was Dr. James Madison Webb. Y'all remember? I mean, I know you don't remember. Okay, he was murdered on the Hartwell Courthouse Square by a group of Yankee soldiers, or possibly men, that were posing as soldiers, May 3rd, 1865. He was murdered right on the corner there beside the Carter Law Building, all right, where the Carter Law Building is today. And that's where he was murdered. He was 35 years old. He was Hartwell's only doctor at the time. It happened about a month after the Civil War had ended, April 9th, 1865, and while the area was under occupation. Several accounts attest to this murder, say that he was shot at home, he was shot there, he was shot there. But the last story I read was he was shot here in town, and then they went and they shot into his house, and the bullet struck his wife, and she carried the bullet until her death in her body. And that part we know is true, because she did. And it was published, okay, this is a Confederate soldier by the name of J.R. Hunt, published in the Elberton Star in 1889, 24 years after the event. The account was said he was part of a group of 15 surrendered Confederate soldiers who were passing through Hartwell at the time of Webb's murder. He stated that his party drove the Yankee soldiers out of Hartwell after they had murdered Webb. The opposing group of soldiers ran into a face-to-face conflict in the town, but the Yankee soldiers backed down because they were outnumbered. He states the reason for Webb's murder was that a Federal soldier had been found dead on the road in front of J.M. Webb's residence. So they shot through Webb's house in retaliation, and what it did was the bullet went straight in and wounded his sister, not his wife. Further details found in yet another account explains a bit different view. And Webb Street in Hartwell is named in his honor. On October 2nd, this is where it gets weird. October 2nd, 1883, in the Banner Watchman. Do you know what paper that is? The Athens paper. Okay, 1883 Athens paper. Herald, yeah. But it was called the Banner Watchman then. Okay, now this is what it says in 1883. A green spot of grass, not larger than a water bucket, stays green winter and spring and summer and fall, because it was soaked with the dying blood of Dr. J.M. Webb, and the spot has remained for the last 18 years. I have looked for that spot around the Carter Law Building, and I think Stephen dug it up. I don't know. But is that not the weirdest thing? It says the grass remains green there all year because it soaked up the blood of Dr. Webb. Okay, there was also a murder hotspot in town. Okay, how did you get across rivers when there were no bridges? Ferries or barges, all right? Now, do you remember what the name of the barge was from Hartwell to Anderson? Does anybody know? It's called Shockley. It was called Shockley's Ferry. And now this is an side note that has nothing to do with anything. Have you ever heard of the Shockley apple? You ever heard of that? It's an apple that was grown during Civil War times. It was good because it was preserved without refrigeration, and it became a very famous staple. It's gone down now, but in the Civil War era, in the early 20s and 30s, it was very popular. Well, they grew naturally by Shockley's Ferry. There was a flood, and it swept all the apple trees downriver, and then so they landed somewhere in South Carolina, way downriver, and then that's where they harvested the Shockley apple, and that's what it's called. That's the weirdest story I've ever heard. But the Shockley apple actually comes from Hartwell, and so it was a famous apple. But anyway, Okay, there were 4 incidences of murder that happened because the Browns bought Shockley's Ferry, and guess what they changed the name to? Brown's Ferry. Isn't that funny? And so Brown's Ferry was a murder haven. It was located on the Savannah River about 2 miles north of the Hartwell Dam. Okay, that's a picture of it in early 1900s. That is the Brown's Ferry. Okay, and then that's where it is on the map, because that's where they put the first bridge at Brown's Ferry. Now, this is Alfred Steel Bridge. This is actually Smith-McGee Bridge, but I want to show you that was where the first bridge was, and that was where Brown's Ferry was, across the river. All right, the Lewis B. Yeah, Lewis B. Marsh. That was the first Lewis B. Marsh Bridge. Remember in 2008, when the lake went down, there were parts of that bridge that could be seen, okay, under the water. Now, all right, there's another picture of it from another angle. Now, the Brown's Ferry, that's where it's marked. The X marks the dam. The line marks where Brown's Ferry was, and that was the lake, the river, before the dam was built. Now, the area is first known, right after the Civil War, with feelings still bitter between the North and the South, a barge loaded with cotton was being held at Brown's Ferry, waiting to be shipped to the North. The cotton belonged to a civilian named Crawford Keyes. The cotton had been seized by the Yankee occupational troops because there was a fort in Anderson on Fant Street. And that was claimed to be the property of the Union. Crawford Keyes was not very happy because there was a barge filled with cotton, and he said he had never given it to the South, so it does not belong as confiscated items. And so all of a sudden, 3 young soldiers were sent from a Union garrison in Anderson to guard the cotton, and during the night of October 6, 1865, a group of armed men attacked the Union soldiers who were guarding the cotton, killing all 3 of them and dumping their bodies and their weapons into the Savannah River. 4 men were accused of being part of the group. They were identified as Crawford Keyes. Guess what? He was the one that did what? He owned the cotton. Elisha Byram, still Byram's here today. Elisha Byram's, Gaines Stowers, that's also a Hartwell name, and Robert Keyes. They were all arrested for the murders. Now, their murders took national attention because they were shipped to Charleston and tried by an army court, and they were sentenced to hang. And then they overturned their convictions and said that they would stay in there for life. And Andrew Johnson, who became president after what? Abraham Lincoln was shot. He commuted their sentence and let them go. And so they came back to Hartwell. And so isn't that crazy? It was in all the national papers. New York Times, it even made it in the European papers. Little Hartwell, Georgia, and where these men had shot these 3 Yankee soldiers. So the sentence was later commuted by President Andrew Johnson. Well, then a little bit after that, there had been another murder within a few miles there 5 weeks earlier. There were several murders at Brown's Ferry. Now, in 1917, May 12th, a ferryman who was 20 years old named William Pierce was murdered at the ferry. He was the ferryman, and his father was the one that ran it, and he also ran the ferry. 5 weeks before that, Bobby Jean McCraw had been murdered there. And guess what the reason for this murder? 3 men were suspected and arrested. 4 men were arrested because they murdered Pierce, and it was because they were running what across the ferry? Moonshine, or starts with an L, rhymes with ichor. That's right, 1917, they were running moonshine. From what area of our county? Reed Creek. Because the Reed Creek area was known for its quality shine. And it was a pretty rough area in the day, all right? Because it was desolate, and there weren't a lot of roads up in that part of the county, And so this poor William Pierce, he was young and he was killed, and they discovered later that he knew something about it, and they were afraid that he was going to tell the authorities. And there's also been a murder at Browns Ferry, and I could not find the name of the person that was killed, that they've never solved. And so there's been 4 distinct killings at Browns Ferry, and so I'm glad they covered it with the bridge. I'm glad it's good. All right, now we do have a lot of murder stuff, but I wanted to talk to you about ghost towns. And one of those, of course, is the town of Andersonville. Now, you see this, there's an island, there's an Andersonville Island. As you go up into South Carolina, when you go to Clemson, then you turn left, there's a long island called Andersonville Island. Now, I know y'all that have lived here know all this stuff, but a lot of us are new people here, so we don't know. There's also a cemetery island, and that was a prominent place where there was a plantation, and the family kept their cemetery there, and that island is still there today, and the family's graves are still there. A lot of people talk about Cemetery Island, but Andersonville Island also has some remnants from the old town of Andersonville on it or around it. Now, beneath the serene surface of Lake Hartwell lies a ghost town lost to time and legend. Before Lake Hartwell was created in the 1960s, there was a small town of Andersonville. But when the Army Corps of Engineers constructed the dam, the fate was sealed. It was founded in 1801. The town of Andersonville, South Carolina, was a thriving textile and trading community, a major distribution center for cotton, wool, and also animal hides. It suffered from repeated flooding. Of course, it was really located in a poor area, and it was bypassed also by the railroad. While the town itself is underwater, some believe that parts of it, including building roads and possibly a cemetery, still exist beneath the depths of the lake. It was a significant trading and textile town, had churches, had stores, and also had a small mill there. So it's all under the lake. Now, there's another town that I was telling you about, and that's where Andersonville was. It was right at the confluence of those two rivers. Now, there's another picture there. Then I want to talk a little bit about Petersburg, because one of the founders of the Methodist movement, Francis Asbury, when he came into Georgia, he preached at Coldwater Creek. He also preached at the little other church in the county. I just went blank. Not Cokesbury, but the other one. No. But anyway, he wrote it in his journal. He crossed at Petersburg. And he would come across at Petersburg, and he would stay in Petersburg, because Petersburg was a large town. It had wide, level ground of confluence of the Broad River. It was Georgia's second largest city and an economic rival to Augusta and Savannah, and it was 70 miles upriver from Augusta. There were stores, warehouses, and shops, blacksmiths, churches, schools, newspapers, all were here. The city's founder, Dionysius Oliver, established a tobacco inspection warehouse in 1786, and for commerce it lured upstate plantations, attracted affluent settlers who helped the settlement grow rapidly. Oliver called it Petersburg because of his birthplace in Virginia and designated it with 86 half-acre lots that had all been sold by 1808. So Petersburg was a fairly large city. Now, historical records describe fine homes, doctors' offices, public well, a network of warehouses and docks, all connected by cobblestone streets. Now, this is another interesting piece of this. Some notable persons that grew up in the area and grew up in Petersburg. William Wyatt Bibbs, who practiced medicine in Petersburg. He was elected as a U.S. representative. He went to serve in the U.S. Senate, and then he moved to Alabama, and he was noted by the president to be the first territorial governor in 1819. He was the first governor of the state of Alabama. He was from Petersburg, Georgia. Also, Charles Tate was brought up with his family in the area, and he also served in the U.S. Senate. So Petersburg had 2 consecutive senators from the state of Georgia. And so it was a very prominent town. George Rockingham Gilmer was born in Wilkes County and was a pupil of the Waddell Academy. He was in the House of Representatives. The only thing that exists of Petersburg today is what we call Petersburg boats. Have you ever heard of those? They were the boats that were flat-bottomed because this part of the river is very hard to navigate, and so they would push themselves with poles. And this is an example of a Petersburg boat. And that was developed in Petersburg, and it did great and did well until tobacco lost favor. And what took its place? The invention of the cotton gin changed everything. And the invention of the cotton gin also destroyed Petersburg. And so when cotton became king, they needed larger boats, and they needed a better way to transport items to port to Savannah. And so the last known sale of a numbered lot in Petersburg was 1837. And so now it's under Lake Thurman, or we call in Georgia, Lake Hartwell, Clark's Hill, and it's remembered today for the boats. Now, there are a couple of weird things that have happened, and this came from interesting thing. There was a night the lights fell, and this was all over the Southeast in 1833. I'm sure some of you remember it. There was a meteor storm. It was not a meteor shower, it was a meteor storm. There were between 100 to 150,000 meteors an hour in 1833. Some plantation owners in this area released their slaves because they thought the world was coming to an end. And they told them where they had sent their family members, and they gave them money. And then after it was over, of course, they went and hunted them down. It was terrible. All right, they thought it was the end of days, and that was November 12th, 1833. It was the meteor shower that we see every year, and that was one of the largest in recorded history in 1833. There was also a day in February 7th in the Southeast, 1835, and it was known as Coal Saturday. It was 15 below zero. Animals, cattle, animals would freeze standing in the field. It was terrible. I just can't even imagine. I mean, I have been in 6 below, but I can't imagine 15 below. And that was February 7th, 1835. That hit the Hartwell area, Wilkes and Elbert and all the county in this area because, of course, Hart County wasn't here. But those things affected the Southeast in very profound ways. Now, just a couple of crazy little things that have happened. That was a tornado that came through here in the 1940s. This is Job Bauer's son. All right, you see? What's his name? Uncle Billy. Guess what? He was only 2 people in Hart County that did what, you know? Voted for Abraham Lincoln. He was an abolitionist, and he voted for Abraham Lincoln. There were 2 people in Hart County that voted for Abraham Lincoln. He was one. The other one, they ran out of town on a railroad through Cannon, and he eventually ended up in a prison camp in the north, and then he died and was buried in a mass grave. But Uncle Billy was very popular, and he was an amazing man, and he founded Bowersville. He also founded several newspapers. He was also a preacher at Old Cannon Baptist Church. And I don't know how back then they knew that you voted for Abraham Lincoln, but they knew that he did. And there were people that for the rest of his life would not talk to him. But amazing, amazing character. And was very much an entrepreneur. Very much an entrepreneur. That's the scary house. That was where Strickland's funeral home is today. Of course, I talked about that this morning. So it was crazy because a lot of people thought that house was haunted. Now, and then I want to close out with this. That's Blind Simmy, who you were listening to, that taught Pink Anderson how to play the guitar, and they both are right there. That's kind of a neat little story of Hartwell lore. Now, then I want to read to you this last little story, and then I told you this morning, Mormons and elders are driven from Bowersville. This was September 23rd, 1901. They were beaten with straps. and all the Mormons were forced out of town. I'm sure that was some of your ancestors, Billy. The vigilante committee refused to accept the Mormons, and they forced them out. Franklin Springs Sanatorium, here was a good thing, and this could help some of you. It's now open for the treatment of drug addicts and alcoholics. The sanatorium beautifully toured to the hills of northeast Georgia, broad and treatment, $15 a week, cure guaranteed. Franklin Springs, all right? And then let me close with this little story. It's great. There was a murder, a prisoner trying to escape, and he killed one of the guards. And the prisoner was eventually hanged in Hartwell on the Square. When that happened, it was, when there was a hanging, there were a lot of people that would come to town. That day on the square, the crowd averaged between 8,000 to 10,000 people. 8,000 to 10,000 people. And it says this: yesterday was a day long remembered in the annals of our county. It was the day appointed for the execution of Henry Hill for the murder of Thomas Skelton. The day was calm and serene, the fields blooming beneath the gentle influences of spring, and the birds caroling their songs of joy in the groves, unconscious of the terrible work to be performed by mere mortals. At the early hour, streams of people came pouring into town, and soon the entire public square was filled with heaving and anxious and restless and impatient throngs awaiting the hour when the criminal should be brought forth from his cell and carried to the place of his horrible doom. Just before 11 o'clock, Sheriff Myers, attended by a suitable corps of assistants, entered the jail to commence preparations for the discharge of the solemn duty before him. As the shackles were taken from the limbs of the prisoner, he seemed completely unnerved. He was deeply affected, grasping the coarse clothes of his bed to wipe the tears profusely streaming from his eyes. It was indeed a sad spectacle to stand and behold a human being prepared and dressed for his coffin. And he, in the vigor of health, and sadder still, that a human being should commit a great and dastardly crime as that such a scene should be rendered necessary. Reverends W.A. Ferris and B.C. Thornton. Ferris, Methodist pastor; Thornton, Baptist pastor, visited the cell while the preparations were going on and conversed with him a short time on religious topics. He said he was willing to go, and after he was dressed, become calm, he quietly asked Mr. Milton Richardson for some tobacco. At length, everything else being ready, the black cap was placed upon his head, the rope adjusted around his neck, the jail doors thrown open, and the stairway descended, where the wagon awaited with his coffin to bear the prisoner to the gallows. At 12 o'clock, the guards numbered perhaps 200. There were 200 guards around him, armed with guns, under the command of the Honorable John G. McCurry, repaired to the jail and formed an open column, and a wagon drove up with a neat coffin. Henry Hill was then brought out, seated upon the coffin. I thought that was pretty convenient, securely pinioned. Here ensued a most affecting scene, the parting of the doomed man from his family. The hardest heart could not but feel sad to hear the poor man's farewells and agonizing shreks to his children. At 12:07, the procession filed its way through the press toward the scaffolding with the guards in front. Upon each side and in the rear, first came the wagon with Henry, and then a buggy with Reverend Ferris, and followed with a number of reporters from different newspapers. The procession arrived at the scaffolding at 12:17. The prisoner, sheriff, deputy sheriff, Reverend W.A. Ferris, B.C. Thornton, doctors Elbert Maris and Page ascended to the scaffolding at 12:20. The prisoner was then informed that he could make any remarks if he desired, and Henry then excitingly exclaimed, "Let my children come where they can see me. Let them come." They were brought inside of the rope enclosure, and one of the children cried out, "Is that my papa? He looks so thin." Henry then said, "Children, honey, see where I am. Did you think you would ever see me here? What brought me here? Regard yourself, keep under guard, stand under guard. Jehovah is not far from me. Don't allow yourself to leave your guard." And look at my head, pointing at the black cap. "My boy, look at your father. Don't let yourself come here. Remember me, children. Live in the fear of God and take care of your mother and the little children. Go from this place where your father has brought with a rope around his neck. This time tomorrow I'll be climbing the hills of Calvary. I will put on a crown in place of these bloody clothes. Come and meet me, children. Your father has done a crime. And if I had listened to my dear wife, I would not have a rope around my neck." See, women are always right. Now I got messed up. You see, I get off around my neck. "She told me before I killed him, 'Henry, pray Mr. Skelton will be good to you.' He then advised his children to stay with those with whom they were working and deplored the evil effects of gambling and drinking. Motioning to his son, he said, 'Keep out of your pocket and a flask of whiskey out of your side pocket. I have been well trained by these men. I am sorry that I did what I did. My soul is going up. If I was going to hell, I would say so. I've been pardoned of my sins. I have felt this for 5 weeks. Remember poor Henry Turner. My name is not Henry Hill. Never take that route I have taken.'" And he goes on to tell his children what to do and what not to do. Here he stopped. Reverend Thornton, First Baptist, gave out the hymn. So you got 10,000 people, you've got reporters, you've got 200 guards, and so First Baptist pastor says, "Let's sing a hymn." And they sang, "Alas, and did my Savior bleed." Henry then cried out, "Come back, children, listen to me one more time." He appeared greatly excited. And then this is, he goes, and then he says, led in the most solemn prayer, William Ferris. After this, Henry stepped upon the platform at 12:50, all the while bidding those in the crowd farewell and asking those who wanted his soul saved to bow their heads. At 12:55, this is so crazy. At 12:55, the drop fell and his body fell with a thud. While there was considerable twitching of the muscles, there were no violent movements of limbs and body. Until 1:03, his pulse remained strong, but commenced going down until 1:06. When it ceased to beat, at 1:08, he was dead. He remained hanging until 1:27, when the physicians pronounced him dead, and his body was cut down and turned over to his friends, and was buried at Cedar Springs last night. His neck was not broken, and he died from strangulation. This ended the scene. Okay. Then, here's the scene. In 1881, after that happened, this was published in the Elberton Gazette. And this article says this, and I'm going to leave you with this because this is important. This week's Elberton Gazette contains this article giving a statement for prominent and responsible citizens of Hart County, going to show that Henry Hill, if buried on the day he was hung, he was buried alive. Or if not buried that evening, there's the possibility of his being alive yet. Okay, there are 10,000 witnesses, there's 200 guards, and there are people saying, he ain't dead. And so in 1881, they published an article in Elberton reminding the Hartwell citizens that he's dead. A number of idle tales like this have been circulated here in Elberton by excitable individuals. Now, I see some excitable individuals, but there's not the ghost of doubt but that Henry Hill was hung until he was dead, and he was not buried until after the hanging, and it follows that he was not buried until after he died. The execution of Henry Hill was carried out with due care and precaution, and the physicians were absolutely certain that he was dead and ensued before the body was taken down from the scaffold. We have no idea our worthy contemporary intended such a thing, But such article of this tendency for even us to have to write is ridiculous, and upon the care and caution of the sheriff and other officers in charge, and should not be published without certain positive, unmistakable proof. A responsible and prominent citizen may be very easily mistaken occasionally. I hope that you have enjoyed our time together. We walked down a little bit of journey. Thank you for coming this afternoon. I don't know it all. All I want to do is spark your interest in the history of our community, because we have a neat community, and I am so excited to be a part of this community. May God bless your day and have a wonderful day. Thank you all for joining us. God bless, and thank you all.